That brings us to our discussion of Neanderthals. Neanderthals are the pre-modern humans that characterize the late Pleistocene. They're not the only ones. We'll talk in a few slides about the Denisovans as another kind of sister species to Neanderthals. But Neanderthals are generally, or at least this kind of classic Neanderthal morphology, they stick out kind of as misfits in the sense that they're like us. They're very much like us with brain sizes within like the normal range of modern humans with culture that's elaborated with, even the ability to interbreed with us, but they're also different from us in some kinds of key characteristic ways. And so this extends to how we classify them. Do we consider them as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis and simply a kind of subspecies level designation, with us being Homo sapiens sapiens, or do we put them in their own species as Homo neanderthalensis? There's an abundance of recent genetic evidence that shows that we interbred with them. And this demonstrates then that this full level of speciation, or kind of this biological species concept, doesn't really apply here if we were able to interbreed and do so quite successfully. Neanderthals date back at least 130,000 years ago. Our knowledge is particularly rich on their lives in the last glacial period, that is, from roughly 75,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago. And really, that last glacial, the Würm Glacial, retreated from the Middle East around 15,000 years ago and retreated out of farther north areas of Europe roughly around 12,000 years ago. So we'll talk first about these classic Neanderthals. Classical Neanderthals are those from Western Europe. They tend to be rather robust with very just kind of bulky skeletons. This is potentially due to a colder glacial climate. And so when we think about the kinds of rules that we see in biology, we talk about two in particular, Bergman's rule and Allen's rule, that deal with kind of body size and body shape, and then deal with limb length. And so generally what we find in colder climates is animals that are kind of stocky built, that might have slightly shorter stature, but be like wider, be kind of like have barrel chests and just thicker bodies. Because what this does is lessens the surface area that's available to lose body heat. If we contrast that to like savanna kinds of hominins, we see, if we just look at human populations, it's the Inuit to Maasai example. The Inuit, an average adult male height of about 5'2", 5'4". The Maasai at 6'4", right? These savanna dwelling species or populations are incredibly long and lean to maximize the surface area that's available to dissipate heat. So Neanderthals have that kind of stocky body build. They also have brain sizes that are well within our range, sometimes even pushing kind of the upper limits of our range. So their average brain size is between 1,300 and 1,400 cubic centimeters. And our average brain size is about 1,250 to 1,350 cubic centimeters. This may also be associated with the metabolic efficiency of large brains in cold weather. And so it may be a function of this stocky body build. Their cranium is large, it's long, it's low, it's slightly bulging. So it's not as rounded on the top. It doesn't kind of curve up very far above brow ridges. Neanderthals have an occipital bun. That means that kind of at the back of the head, where your head's curving back in or your skull's curving back in towards the base, there would be an oval kind of almost like a bun in the oven kind of shape, right? That you're talking about like a loaf of bread that's rough baked, not in a pan that it's going to take the shape of. That kind of oval but still rounded shape is the occipital bun. Their forehead rises more vertically though than Homo erectus. And so we're starting to see some changes in their face. They also have the arching brow ridges that kind of give you that parabolic shape above the eyes. Their faces project forward, so it's almost like they hooked somewhere around their nose with like a fishing hook or something like that and just pulled the whole face forward. This is something that's functionally different from modern human populations, and it could be related to things like really large sinus cavities. We see different nose shapes certainly between warm and cold climates, with the noses in warm or colder climates being massive with massive sinus cavities. What this does is lowers the metabolic burden of breathing because you can warm up the air before it ever hits the lungs. If we deliver cold air directly to our lungs, we're going to have an energetic kind of cost of very rapidly bringing that air up to body temperature. Their postcranial skeleton's robust. They've got large barrel chests. They're very powerfully muscled. They use their body with like brute force. And they have shorter limbs. This is what's consistent with Allen's rule that basically states that at higher latitudes or higher elevation where the temperature's colder, the limbs are going to be shorter. This also then reduces the surface area that's available to lose heat. They have cultural features that include evidence of deliberate burials. They've got the potential for cannibalism with some relatively recent finds. They may even have evidence for what we would consider patrilineal organization because of a quote unquote like kind of small family group of Neanderthals that was characterized by three related males, three unrelated females, and their corresponding five offspring, showing that these males stayed with their kin well into adulthood. And then they were characterized by Upper Paleolithic tool traditions. So when we look at Central Europe, we can look in areas like Krapina, Croatia, and Vindija, which is about, I think, 30 or 45 kilometers away from Krapina. The typifying or kind of the naming of Neanderthals came out of Germany's Neander Valley. Tal actually is the German word for valley. So Neanderthal literally translates into Neander Valley. So a lot of the characteristic features of Neanderthals are named after those German specimens. The specimens in Croatia are pretty rich. There's 1,000 fragments. They represent up to 70 individuals and more than 1,000 stone tools or flakes. Krapina is an old site dating to about 130 to 110,000 years ago. And they display this full suite of classical Neanderthal features. This barrel chest, this robust musculature and robust postcranial skeleton, the shorter limbs, etc. And they also show evidence of intentional burial. And so, how do we know when bodies are buried intentionally? Well, sometimes it can be because of the positioning of the bodies. And so we'll talk specifically with Neanderthal burials about a flexed position, almost kind of like a fetal position, but lying on your back. So when we think about the fetal position of infants, we think of having the knees drawn up to the chest and the arms then down around the knees, kind of holding your knees into your chest. This same sort of shape is this flexed position. It's just that you're rolling the fetal position over onto the back. We also infer things about intentional burial from the use of pigment like red ochre to adorn the bodies, from the presence of a lot of pollen granules, which is indicative of kind of decorating the body with or the gravesite with flowers, and then also through the possession of what we call grave goods, or including tools and such in with the body that's been buried. In Vindija, Vindija is an excellent source of not just hominid materials, but also the faunal assemblages and the cultural materials. It's stratified in sequence through much of the late Pleistocene. The Vindija specimens are much more recent. They date to about 42,000 to 32,000 years ago. There's 35 separate specimens that represent some of these most recent Neanderthals ever found. We also, though, see relatively recent finds in Western Europe as well. So we've got the Chapelle site, which is dates to about 38,000 years ago. So the tenure of Neanderthals in Europe is pretty extensive. It includes a period of roughly 15 to maybe even 20,000 years of living contemporaneously with anatomically modern humans. We've got Neanderthal sites in Western Asia that include Israel and Iraq. In Israel, the Neanderthals that we see are a lot more gracile than those in Europe, so their skeleton's not as robust. They're kind of quote unquote daintier or more petite. And they are contemporaries of anatomically modern humans in the same area. There's one site, Tabun, that has one of the best known skeletons. It was a female skeleton that dates back to about 120 to 110,000 years ago. We've also got the Kabara skull that dates to about 60,000 years ago. And this includes the intentional burial of a large male with a complete thorax and pelvis, including the hyoid bone. And so this specimen in particular gives us some insight into whether or not Neanderthals possessed language. In Iraq, we've got potential evidence for caring for the disabled. And so what's pictured here is Shanidar 1. This was a male who lived to about 30 to 45 years of age, stood about 5'7" tall, had a cranial capacity of about 1,600 cubic centimeters, so larger than what we see with most modern human populations, and had evidence of healed trauma. So if you look at his left eye orbit relative to his right eye orbit, you can see that there's been fracturing and healing there, giving it a different shape. This has also distorted that side of his skull somewhat. And he was missing parts of his right arm. So here you've got an image of the left arm compared to the right arm. And so we see that we don't have the base of the bone of this right arm, which implies that he was either born without part of his arm, which could have been a birth defect, or it could have atrophied due to some kind of trauma that was experienced earlier in life, or could have even been amputated. So he's missing like his right hand and such. So what does this tell us? Well, if you're partially blind or blind in one eye and missing a hand, you're not going to be a very successful hunter. The fact that he lived to 35 or 40 shows us that we've got long-term care for individuals who are disabled or differently abled. And so this represents kind of expression of a higher level of cognitive and cultural capacity than we originally thought possible for Neanderthals. Neanderthals not only kind of had ritual associated with burying their dead, but also would care for people that weren't able to take care of themselves. We don't even see this in every hunter-gatherer population. I mean, it depends on at what age you're injured. I mean, hunter-gatherers routinely care for people who are ill or injured, but if they've got a baby that's born with a birth defect, up until fairly recent time, that includes settlement into often religiously based or missionary based reservations, you'd see infanticide or at least disinvestment, where you stop taking care of that child because you're not going to get a good return on your investment. In Central Asia, we've got Tashiktash in Uzbekistan, where we've got a relatively complete Neanderthal child, as well as the association with Mousterian tools. Much of the Central Asian fossil record is fragmentary, and so we haven't really been able to put together a good clear picture of what the Central Asian Neanderthals looked like. But we do have fragmentary specimens from southern Siberia, from at least 4 sites, that we've been able to sequence DNA from, and we get what's considered a distinctly Neanderthal genetic pattern. This brings us to the idea, though, of a perhaps sister species. There's an area in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia that contains a cave that is known as Denisova Cave. The first fragments of skeletal material were found here. Really the only material we initially had were a finger bone, a pinky finger, and one tooth, and that tooth happened to be a molar. And the finger and the tooth both dated to somewhere between about 50 and 30,000 years ago. The mitochondrial DNA sequences of this finger bone match neither Neanderthals nor AMHs, and so then a headline came out saying, we've got this new species of hominin. The genetic distance through both the mitochondrial DNA and the nuclear DNA testing suggests a split from Neanderthals and anatomically modern Homo sapiens at about 1 million years ago. The entire nuclear genome has been sequenced. And there have been some recent finds in China then, in Linjing, that include 46 fragments that fit together to form 2 crania. This is the first kind of quote unquote picture that we've gotten of Denisovans. These were found in like 2017, a little bit earlier, published in 2017. And they demonstrate very large brains. One of these crania had a capacity of about 1,800 cubic centimeters, so a much larger brain than even modern Homo sapiens. These Denisovans differ from Neanderthals now that we have the cranium in having thinner brow ridges and a less robust overall kind of skull. So their skull bones are getting thinner. Another recent find is a hybrid individual that dates to about 90,000 years ago. This was a young girl that they've named Denny, who has a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. We've also got a third recent find of the identification of quote unquote alien DNA in modern day Melanesians. So people living in places like Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and into Oceania. This wasn't really alien DNA. It just is evidence that up to 5% of the Papua New Guinea or Melanesian genome comes from Denisovans themselves. So, what we've got pictured here on the right, at the top, we've got these two crania that have been kind of reconstructed from these 46 fragments. In the middle, we have this kind of story of the case of genetic admixture that somewhere around 1 million years ago, a population presumably of Homo heidelbergensis differentiated into the ancestors of modern Homo sapiens, or the Heidelbergensis that stayed modern Homo sapiens, let's say. And these archaics, the Neanderthals and Denisovans that moved up through the Middle East and on into farther northern areas of Europe and Asia. Neanderthals essentially stayed in Central Asia west on into Europe, and Denisovans branched off into Eastern Asia. We then have periods of interbreeding. We have evidence of Neanderthals interbreeding with modern humans in both Europe and the Middle East. We've got, and Central Asia as well. We've got evidence of Denisovans interbreeding with anatomically modern humans, particularly as we have this identification of Denisovan sequences in Melanesian DNA. And then we've got Neanderthals and Denisovans interbreeding with one another. So this gives us some insight, certainly, into kind of our molecular relationship and factors into this decision of do we designate them as separate species or not. The bottom picture just represents kind of fleshed out artistic, well, not fleshed out, but fully, you know, well, fleshed out in a figurative meaning, as in we didn't put muscles and then skin on these skeletons, but what these skeletons potentially are the comparison between modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans would have looked like. I mean, as you look at both this Denisovan and Neanderthal skull, you see that it doesn't go up as much. I mean, we have a forehead, but it's not this entirely vertical high forehead. The brain cases are more oblong, more like a watermelon shape almost, which gives us evidence then of this occipital bun. One other feature to notice here, aside also from the prominent brow ridge, is that Neanderthals and Denisovans didn't have a chin. If you notice, their lower jaw angles backwards, whereas modern human lower jaws come down vertically with a very clearly pronounced chin. There's been some relatively recent evidence to suggest that these chins were sexually selected and were thusly considered more attractive for the males who possessed them by the females that were looking for mates. So, yeah, I suppose, and this is poetic license, right? This is just thinking creatively. I mean, one explanation potentially for why we eventually see Neanderthals and Denisovans, albeit with some admixture, dying out or being replaced by modern humans is this sexy chin, maybe, hypothesis that there was some aspect of modern human morphology, and one different skeletal thing here is this chin that gave us kind of this sexy male. Neanderthals and Denisovans both have, well, Denisovans presumably, because we don't have the wide fossil evidence that we do with Neanderthals, but demonstrate Upper Paleolithic tool traditions with some regional variability. The industry that's most often associated with Neanderthals is the Mousterian industry. However, it's not confined to Neanderthals, so there are early anatomically modern humans who were using Mousterian tools as well. The Mousterian toolkit is characterized by a larger proportion of flake tools. So remember last week that we talked about the Acheulean kind of hand axe or chopper where we bilaterally retouched this core. For these Mousterian tools, we are then reshaping flakes that we break off. So we're breaking off fairly large flakes that can be reshaped into knives and into even projectile points. We talked about the Le Voilà kind of process of manufacturing these tools that can result in something that could be a projectile point, like a spear point. There wasn't an innovation of a new tradition that's regional that is found in France and Spain called the Châtel-Perronian. And in sub-Saharan Africa, we've got things like a similar sort of progression from Mousterian tools to more highly specialized Mousterian tools. We see an extension and diversification of traditional methods of making tools. We see more pressure flaking versus kind of the contact or sharp striking that to flake things. We started to see the development of specialized tools for skinning and preparing meat, for hunting, particularly for hafting onto a spear to be a jabbed spear, for woodworking like chisels and awls, and also for hafting. This provides evidence for Neanderthals exploiting new food sources. They were successful hunters, and they were spear hunting large game. I mean, we've got situations of Neanderthals with things like mammoths and mastodons, with things like cave bears. They had limited skill, though, in throwing spears. They didn't, for example, develop the atlatl, which is a spear throwing device that allows you to extend your reach much farther and deliver the spear with more force and acceleration. So they also did not develop bow and arrow technology. So we see Neanderthal fossils with a lot of trauma and healed trauma. So their hunting methods were incredibly risky. There was a relatively recent headline that came out last year that talked about how this difference in hunting strategies translates into a difference in kind of cognition and thusly art complexity. And so it examined the difference between kind of Neanderthal cave art and modern human cave art, and that we don't see as many like arcing circular lines represented in Neanderthal art. It's much more kind of rigid straight lines, less creative and stylized than what we see with modern humans. And so the hypothesis that was put forward for this was that because Neanderthals weren't throwing spears very much, they were mostly just thrusting spears, that this kind of I don't know, this part of the brain that's associated with higher level math and cognition that can do things like make predictions based on physics wasn't as elaborated among Neanderthals as it was with modern human populations. There's general consensus, though we could say that debate still exists, that modern or that Neanderthals were capable of human speech. There's nothing in their skeletal remains, whether we're talking about their thorax, whether we're talking about the hyoid bone, whether we're talking about the regions that house the vocal cords, that would tell us that they couldn't speak. Their hyoid bone is essentially modern. And so presumably they would have been capable of articulate speech and possibly even capable of producing a range of sounds that's very similar to what modern humans are able to produce. They also, though, I mean, to kind of discuss this development of symbolic behavior and symbols and symbolic behavior are really tightly tied into this discussion of what we call the advent of behavioral modernity or the development of modern human culture. We are a cultural species, and much of our cultural representation is symbolic in nature. Well, that ability to kind of appreciate art appreciate symbols is present in Neanderthals as well. They did personally adorn their bodies, both through pigment, like red ochre used to paint their bodies. There are deposits of both red ochre and yellow ochre in Neanderthal sites, as well as jewelry. And so, what we have pictured on the bottom left here are some recent pieces of Neanderthal jewelry that were made out of eagle talons. These represent a relatively recent archaeological find. The middle picture is also in your textbook. It's uh, demonstrating how seashells were used for jewelry as well. And then the picture on the right represents this deliberate burial of the dead, this flexed position. And you see that the legs have been folded up and kind of crossed at the ankle, but folded up into the chest, kind of in this on your back fetal position. We do call this again the flexed position. So Neanderthals arguably had what we would call religiosity. That is, some belief in the supernatural. The way that they adorned their dead, the way that they ritually buried their dead, is consistent with them having a belief in something higher than life here on earth, a belief in kind of a potential afterlife, a belief in something akin to what modern human populations refer to as heaven. I mean, why else would you adorn your bodies and ritually pose your bodies, if not because it's tied to their journey back to the Creator, to the afterlife, to wherever it is that the spirits of dead bodies go. And so, how do we put it all together? Well, understanding postmodern humans has certainly been aided by molecular techniques. Generally, we are able to sequence the genomes of modern humans. When bone is still bone, we're able to get a consistent enough and well preserved enough DNA specimen from that. And so we have like the 5 million, or not 5 million, sorry, that way different time scale, 5,000-year-old Ötzi the Iceman from Europe. We've also got Inuit who are anywhere from about 3 or 4,000 years of it old to about 1,400 years old that have been preserved in parts of Canada and Alaska. When we find remains like this, we are certainly able to sequence the DNA. We've had, though, of late, considerable luck getting DNA out of both Denisovan and Neanderthal fossils. We've improved our technology of being able, through what we talked about earlier, polymerase chain reaction. We can turn small samples of DNA into large collections of DNA that we can study, right? We can replicate small samples of DNA to have enough that we can really manipulate and study. And it's putting together some interesting pictures with respect to how Neanderthals, modern humans, and Denisovans fit together. Critically, we identify waves of interbreeding, and these have been verified through mitochondrial DNA, through nuclear DNA, through microsatellite DNA, through multiple kind of means. I mean, they all verify the same picture that we had interbreeding events between Neanderthals and modern humans, interbreeding events between Denisovans and modern humans, and interbreeding events between Neanderthals and Denisovans. So we shouldn't think of these pre-modern humans, particularly the question of dun, 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 what happened to Neanderthals or what happened to Denisovans, in the sense that we consider like Homo erectus to have been replaced by more modern forms. We don't see this same kind of total, like, I mean, modern humans didn't come into regions where Neanderthals and Denisovans were living and just, kill off mass amounts of Neanderthals. They also didn't just outright competitively exclude them. Neanderthals and Denisovans were quite successful and were valued as potential mating partners for modern humans. So saying that we were replaced by Neanderthals isn't an entirely accurate picture, or that we replaced Neanderthals, rather, isn't an entirely accurate picture. We we did essentially replace them, but not without intrusions from their genome into ours. And so, of course, with the advent of modern websites that allow you to sequence your DNA and find out your ethnicity and find out your ancestry and such, we can identify that different human populations, different extant human populations, have different proportions of Neanderthal DNAs. The highest proportion of Neanderthal genes is actually found among Native Americans. Of course, the highest proportion of Denisovan genes is found among Melanesians. It's hard, though, for us to put together a clear evolutionary picture. It's hard to place these species taxonomically. Do we give them their own species level designation and treat them as a paleofossil? That would put Neanderthals as Homo neanderthalensis. I haven't seen a species level designation for Denisovans. It could be, I guess, Homo denisovanensis. I really don't know. They've just been collectively referred to in the literature as Denisovans. Um, or should we consider them subspecies of species of modern humans? Are they Homo sapiens neanderthalensis? I tend towards the latter, but I'm more of a lumper than I am a splitter. I don't see very much value in thinking of them as separate species when we've got an abundance of genetic evidence across, multiple genomes, both the mitochondrial genome and the nuclear genome, that verify this story of interbreeding, of successive waves of interbreeding. I prefer to think of them as regional variation of a polytypic species. And, potentially, if we hadn't had this era of European colonialism, we could have had similar level differences between modern human populations if we had remained genetically isolated. We didn't, though. European imperialism and colonialism led to European genetic admixture with indigenous populations around the world. So it's kind of a moot point to talk about that. But so I would put us as separate subspecies, not separate species. Pre-modern humans are definitely viewed as transitional between earlier Homo erectus and later anatomically modern humans. We will continue kind of this carryover of our discussion into the origins then of anatomically modern Homo sapiens next week as we talk about the rise and spread of modern humans. And we'll see that we've got differing schools of thought. I already mentioned that many of the Chinese researchers are trying to kind of revitalize or resurrect this idea of multi-regionalism, that regional populations of Homo erectus independently transitioned into pre-modern humans and then modern human populations versus this single point of origin idea that we evolved in one place and one time in Africa and then kind of left Africa and spread the rest of the world over. So, in summary, recognize that pre-modern humans from the Middle Pleistocene show similarities both to their predecessors, Homo erectus, and to their successors, Homo sapiens. They're found throughout the Old World. They are very widely distributed. Most paleoanthropologists call the majority of these pre-modern fossils Homo heidelbergensis. There's a lot of similarities between the populations in Europe and Africa that lend credence to this designation, but the Asian populations stick out as somewhat different. Some of the later Homo heidelbergensis in Europe evolved then into Neanderthals and Denisovans and spread into separate areas. I mean, they probably split in the Middle East and the Levant, with Denisovans moving east and Neanderthals kind of staying put and moving west. There's an abundance of Neanderthal fossils and Neanderthal archaeological evidence from about 130,000 to about 30,000 years ago when they disappear. Neanderthals are more geographically restricted than other populations of early pre-moderns. They're found in Europe, southwestern Asia, and Central Asia. And Neanderthals have been considered quite distinct from modern humans. When we look at the evidence genetically, however, we don't get such a clear picture. They look a lot different from us kind of on the surface, but when we analyze their genome, um, and we look for this evidence of interbreeding, we find we're not so different after all. I'm going to post a meme in your reading and resources folders that was posted on the bioanthropology Facebook page the other day. That's just really, really funny. It's talking about kind of our perception of Neanderthals, and then well, I can't fully explain it. It's just really amusing because we have tended to think of them as brutish and primitive, but as more and more sites become available, we're finding out that they were incredibly cultured. They cared deeply for each other. They had some religiosity, belief in some kind of afterlife. They cared for the disabled, and they overlap so much with many of the cultural features that we find in modern human populations.